3,200 kilometers. That's how far Canada just moved a trainload of wheat from Manitoba to Mexico City. Not through American ports, not using American rails, straight past American exporters who assumed that grain belonged to them. September 2025. Mark Carney and CPKC President Keith Creel stood together in Mexico City to celebrate the arrival. Canadian Western Red Spring Wheat, premium quality, delivered directly to Mexican flour mills. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This was proof that the grain trade routes defining North American agriculture for over a century are being redrawn, and the United States is discovering it's no longer necessary for Canadian grain to reach global markets. For 30 years, Mexico bought American grain. It was automatic. The foundation of agricultural trade across North America. Geography made it inevitable, or so everyone thought. Then Trump launched his trade war to protect American farmers, and Mexico quietly started buying from Canada instead. Tonight, we're showing you how a single railway transformed North American grain trade. Which American ports are losing billions as Canadian trains bypass them entirely. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Section 1. The 3,200-kilometer journey. Let's start with the train itself. September 2025. A CPKC freight train departs from Manitoba, loaded with Canadian Western Red Spring Wheat, premium grade, high protein content, exactly what Mexican flour mills need for bread, pasta, and tortilla production. The train travels 3,200 kilometers south, through Saskatchewan, across the Canadian prairies, into the United States at North Dakota. And here's what makes this remarkable. Most of the journey crosses American territory. The train passes through Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. CPKC crews take over at multiple points. According to industry reports, there are approximately 11 crew changes within the United States alone. So American workers are being paid to move Canadian grain to Mexican buyers. Grain that used to flow through American export terminals, generating fees for American port operators, American grain handlers, and American shipping companies. The infrastructure benefits remain in the United States. The jobs remain. The rail operations continue. But the export business that's gone elsewhere. The train crosses into Mexico at Laredo, Texas, continues south through Mexican states, arrives in Mexico City where Mark Carney and Keith Creel are waiting to celebrate. The arrival marks something extraordinary, a complete North American grain supply chain that bypasses American export infrastructure entirely. No Gulf Coast ports, no Pacific Northwest terminals, no American intermediaries taking cuts at every transfer point. Just Canadian grain moving directly from Canadian producers to Mexican buyers on rails that happen to cross American territory. Keith Creel, CPKC's president and CEO, said it explicitly. Our powerful North American rail network is enhancing safety, competition, and resiliency, and expanding route options and market access for Canada's grain shippers. That phrase, expanding route options, is diplomatic code for something more direct. Canadian grain no longer needs American ports, and market access for Canada's grain shippers means Canadian producers can reach Mexican buyers without depending on American logistics companies that might suddenly become unreliable due to Trump's policy chaos. CPKC's official statements confirm the railroad now moves a variety of Canadian grains to Mexico regularly. Wheat, oats, canola oils, specialty crops. This isn't occasional shipments. This is building systematic trade flows. According to Transport Canada's Pathways report, over 94% of Canadian grain exported to foreign markets is transported by rail. That statistic reveals both the dominance of rail in Canadian grain logistics and the strategic importance of controlling railway routes. CPKC transported 5.51 million metric tons of grain to the United States and 5.25 million metric tons to Eastern Canada in 2023. But here's what those numbers do on show. The shift happening in 2024 and 2025. CPKC's grain plan for 2002. Section 2. The 30-year relationship that just ended. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how Mexican grain imports worked for the past 3 decades. Mexico is a major grain importer. The country produces significant amounts of corn domestically, but wheat, soybeans, barley, and specialty grains need to be imported to meet demand. For 30 years, those imports came primarily from the United States: American wheat from Kansas, corn from Iowa, soybeans from the Midwest, all of it flowing south through established logistics networks that everyone assumed were permanent. The infrastructure was built around American dominance: grain elevators near the border designed to handle Mexican demand, rail corridors optimized for north-south traffic, export terminals at Gulf Coast ports positioned to serve Latin American markets. Mexican buyers got reliable supply, American farmers got predictable demand. The entire system functioned smoothly because both sides benefited, and nobody had reason to disrupt it. Geography reinforced the arrangement. Mexico shares a 3,145-kilometer border with the United States. Canadian border is far to the north. Simple distance suggested American grain would always be cheaper and more convenient. That assumption ignored two critical factors. First, geography matters less than logistics. Distance isn't the issue if the infrastructure doesn't exist. The United States had the rail networks, the border crossings, the customs procedures, all optimized for Mexican trade. But Canada could build those things, and once built, distance becomes irrelevant if the service is better. Second, reliability matters more than proximity. Mexican buyers need to know grain will arrive on schedule, that prices won't spike suddenly due to policy changes, that supply won't be disrupted by political tensions. For 30 years, American reliability wasn't questioned. Then Trump launched his trade war: tariffs on Mexican steel and aluminum, threats to tear up NAFTA, border chaos, immigration rhetoric that insulted Mexican dignity, trade negotiations conducted through Twitter threats rather than diplomatic channels. Mexican buyers started wondering, can we depend on American supply? And when buyers start questioning reliability, they start looking for alternatives. Canada was waiting with an answer. Section 3, CPKC, the railway Trump didn't see coming. Canadian Pacific, Kansas City is the railway that changed everything. CPKC was created in 2023 when Canadian Pacific acquired Kansas City Southern, forming the first single-line railway connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Before the merger, Canadian grain heading to Mexico had to use multiple railways: Canadian Pacific or Canadian National to move it south, transfer to American railways at the border, another transfer to Kansas City Southern at the US-Mexico border. Every transfer meant delays, additional handling costs, more opportunities for disruption. The merger eliminated all of that. Now CPKC operates a seamless 32,200-kilometer network spanning 3 countries, a single company controlling the entire route from Canadian prairies to Mexican consumers. That integration creates enormous competitive advantages. First, operational efficiency. No transfers between different railway companies mean faster transit times and lower costs. Grain loaded in Manitoba arrives in Mexico City without being touched by multiple operators. Second, pricing transparency. Canadian shippers negotiate directly with CPKC for the entire journey. No hidden fees from multiple carriers. No uncertainty about costs at each transfer point. Third, reliability. A single company responsible for the entire route means consistent service standards. If something goes wrong, there's one operator to coordinate with, rather than 3 different companies blaming each other. And critically, CPKC has strong incentives to build Canadian-Mexican grain trade. Every trainload of Canadian grain delivered to Mexico generates revenue across the entire 3,200-kilometer route. The railroad profits from moving Canadian exports, so it actively markets Canadian grain to Mexican buyers. American railways, they profit from moving American grain. They have no incentive to help Canadian producers reach Mexican markets. CPKC announced over $500 million Canadian dollars in investment. Section 4. Which American ports are losing billions? So which American ports are actually losing Canadian grain shipments? Let's trace the traditional flows and see where they're being redirected. Gulf Coast ports: Houston, New Orleans, Corpus Christi. For decades, these ports handled significant Canadian grain moving south for export to Latin America. The logic was straightforward. Canadian grain travels by rail to Gulf Coast terminals, gets loaded onto ships, sails to Mexico, Central America, South America. But if Canadian grain is going directly to Mexico via CPKC, those Gulf Coast volumes disappear. Why ship grain to Houston, load it on vessels, and sail it to Mexican ports when you can deliver it by rail directly to Mexico City? The maritime route made sense when rail connections didn't exist. Now that CPKC provides direct service, ocean shipping becomes unnecessary for Mexican deliveries. Every train load that goes to Mexico City instead of Houston is revenue Gulf Coast ports will never recapture. Pacific Northwest ports, Seattle, Tacoma, Portland. These ports historically handled massive volumes of Canadian grain, destined for Asian markets. Canadian grain would move by rail from the prairies to Pacific Northwest terminals, get loaded onto ships, and sail to Japan, South Korea, China, Indonesia. But Canada has been systematically expanding its own West Coast export capacity. The Port of Vancouver handled approximately 20 million metric tons of grain in recent years. The Port of Prince Rupert is being expanded specifically to handle more grain exports. When Canadian grain goes through Canadian ports to Asian markets, American Pacific Northwest terminals lose the business. According to industry reports, Canadian grain exports through Vancouver have been setting records. The expansion of port capacity, combined with CN and CPKC investments in rail efficiency, means Canadian grain can reach Asian buyers through Canadian infrastructure without touching American soil. Great Lakes and St. Lawrence ports, Duluth and other Great Lakes terminals traditionally handled Canadian grain moving through the St. Lawrence Seaway system, but eastern Canadian ports, Montreal with 4 million metric tons, and Quebec with 3.4 million metric tons are capturing more of that business as Canadian shippers prioritize routes that do depend on American cooperation. The Port of Thunder Bay, which handled 1.4 million metric tons of grain, serves as a key connection point for moving Canadian grain to eastern ports and avoiding American Gulf Coast terminals entirely. The cumulative impact is significant. American ports that depend on Canadian grain for volumes are facing declining throughput. Port workers face reduced hours. Terminal operators face lower revenues, and the entire ecosystem of businesses supporting grain exports, inspectors, logistics companies, freight forwarders, stevedores, are experiencing contraction. According to congressional reports on Canadian tourism boycotts, similar economic pain is spreading across border states. The grain redirection adds agricultural logistics losses on top of tourism losses. Communities that built their economies around Canadian cross-border trade are discovering that Canadian dollars, whether from tourists or grain exports, are disappearing. Section 5. The USMCA irony. Here's where the irony becomes perfect. Trump negotiated USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, to replace NAFTA. He called it the greatest trade deal in American history. He promised it would lock Mexico into North American trade and protect American economic interests forever. And in one sense, he was right. USMCA does lock Mexico into North American trade. It reduces tariffs. It establishes common standards. It creates frameworks for dispute resolution. What Trump didn't realize is that North American trade doesn't automatically mean American trade. Canada is also part of North America, and USMCA creates the exact same market access for Canadian exports to Mexico that it creates for American exports. So when CPKC offers Mexican buyers Canadian grain with better logistics, more reliable supply, and no exposure to Trump's policy chaos, USMCA provides the legal framework making that trade seamless. No tariffs on Canadian grain entering Mexico. No discriminatory regulations, no trade barriers. Trump negotiated an agreement that protects Canadian access to Mexican markets just as much as it protects American access. And now Canada is using that agreement to systematically replace American agricultural exports. The trade deal Trump thought would protect American farmers is actually the legal mechanism enabling Canadian farmers to capture American market share. Mexican buyers can choose Canadian suppliers over American ones, and USMCA ensures they face no penalties for doing so. This is strategic incompetence at a breathtaking scale. Trump spent years negotiating a trade agreement that he believed would benefit the United States. He held rallies celebrating USMCA as proof of his deal-making genius. He promised farmers it would guarantee their access to Mexican markets. Instead, it guaranteed Canadian access to those same markets. And when Trump's chaos made American supply unreliable, Mexican buyers had a tariff-free alternative waiting. Canada even launched electronic phytosanitary export certificates for grain to Mexico in November 2025, specifically to facilitate this trade. According to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the electronic system reduces the risk of fraud and eliminates longer delivery times associated with mailing paper documents. The infrastructure being built is designed for long-term systematic trade, not occasional opportunistic shipments. USMCA provides the legal framework, CPKC provides the logistics infrastructure, and Trump's chaos provides the motivation for Mexican buyers to actually use both. Section 6. WHY Mexico chose Canada. So why did Mexican buyers actually shift from American to Canadian suppliers? It wasn't just about CPKC's logistics advantages. It was about trust. For 30 years, Mexico trusted American grain supply. Then Trump spent his presidency demonstrating that trust was misplaced. He threatened to tear up NAFTA, creating months of uncertainty about whether North American agricultural trade would even continue. He imposed tariffs on Mexican steel and aluminum, triggering Mexican counter-tariffs on American agricultural products. He threatened to close the border over immigration, which would have disrupted all cross-border trade, including grain shipments. He used Twitter to insult Mexico, attacking the country's dignity and treating it as subordinate rather than a partner. Every single one of these actions sent a message to Mexican buyers: American supply is unreliable. Political chaos can disrupt deliveries at any moment. Depending on American grain means accepting vulnerability to Trump's whims. Canadian suppliers offered something different: stability. Canada doesn't threaten to close borders over unrelated policy disputes. Canadian trade policy doesn't change based on presidential Twitter outbursts. Canadian supply chains don't face sudden disruption because of immigration rhetoric. Mexican buyers conducting long-term planning need predictability. They need to know grain will arrive on schedule, that prices won't spike suddenly due to tariff threats, that logistics won't collapse because of border chaos. Canada provides that predictability. America under Trump does not. But it's not just about avoiding chaos, it's about building relationships. When Mark Carney and Keith Creel traveled to Mexico City to celebrate that first grain train arrival, they weren't just delivering wheat, they were demonstrating commitment. Canadian leadership showing up in person to mark Mexican agricultural partnerships signals that Canada values the relationship, that Mexican markets matter to Canadian producers, that this isn't transactional supply, it's strategic partnership. Trump, by contrast, treats Mexico as a problem to be solved through threats, rather than a partner to be valued through cooperation. Mexican buyers notice the difference. CPKC's official marketing emphasizes diversifying end markets. Amid trade policy uncertainty, that language resonates with Mexican buyers who experienced that uncertainty firsthand under Trump. They're not just buying Canadian grain, they're buying insurance against American unreliability. And once those supply relationships are established, once Mexican mills discover Canadian wheat works perfectly for their production, once logistics networks are optimized for Canadian-Mexican direct trade, they don't reverse just because American political leadership changes. The shift is structural, not temporary. Section 7. The permanent infrastructure shift. This brings us to why the 3,200-kilometer grain train matters far beyond a single shipment. It's proof of concept for permanent infrastructure realignment. CPKC isn't just moving grain opportunistically when American supply is disrupted. They're building systematic capacity for long-term Canadian-Mexican agricultural trade. $500 million in hopper car investments, 100 new locomotives, upgraded rail infrastructure across the three-nation network, electronic phytosanitary certification systems specifically for Canadian grain entering Mexico. These are investments in permanent trade infrastructure, not temporary workarounds. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada estimated the 2025 Canadian crop at approximately 94 million metric tons, with Western Canada accounting for roughly 70 million metric tons. CN anticipates moving 27 to 29.5 million metric tons during the 2025 to 2026 crop year. CPKC is expanding capacity to handle similar volumes. Not all of that grain is going to Mexico. Much goes to Asia through Vancouver. Some goes to Europe through eastern Canadian ports. But every year, an increasing percentage is flowing directly to Mexican buyers via CPKC rails. According to CPKC's grain plan, The company is actively helping customers diversify their end markets amid trade policy uncertainty. That's not passive shipping, that's active marketing. CPKC is encouraging Canadian grain producers to sell to Mexican buyers and offering logistics solutions that make those sales profitable. The railroad profits from every ton that moves across its network, so it has strong financial incentives to build Canadian-Mexican grain trade and reduce Canadian dependence on American export routes. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Mexican buyers discover Canadian grain works well for their needs. They sign multi-year supply contracts with Canadian producers. CPKC invests more in infrastructure to handle the growing volumes. Canadian farmers plant more acres, knowing Mexican demand is reliable. Each step makes the trade relationship more permanent. And here's the critical insight. Once established, these trade relationships rarely reverse. Mexican flour mills that retool their operations to process Canadian wheat do unswitch back to American wheat just because Trump leaves office. CPKC doesn't abandon its Canadian-Mexican grain corridor investments just because American political chaos subsides. Canadian farmers don't terminate profitable long-term contracts with Mexican buyers just because American markets become available again. The 30-year pattern of Mexican grain, coming primarily from the United States, is over. What's replacing it isn't temporary substitution, it's permanent structural realignment. Section 8. What American farmers are losing. Let's be concrete about what American agricultural exporters are actually losing. First, market share. Mexican grain imports that used to come from Kansas, Iowa, and the Midwest are now coming from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. That's not just lost revenue, that's lost future relationships. Mexican buyers building supply chains around Canadian grain won't easily switch back. Second, logistics revenue. Gulf Coast ports, Pacific Northwest terminals, American railways, all used to profit from handling Canadian grain on its way to global markets. Those fees are gone. The grain still moves, but American infrastructure no longer gets paid for moving it. Third, economies of scale. When Canadian grain flowed through American ports alongside American grain, it created volumes that made operations more efficient. Larger vessels could be filled, terminal operators could negotiate better shipping rates. The entire system benefited from combined Canadian-American volumes. As Canadian grain gets redirected to Canadian ports or directly to Mexico, those efficiencies disappear. American exporters handle smaller volumes, face higher per-unit costs, and become less competitive globally. Fourth, blending opportunities. Different wheat varieties from different regions can be blended to meet specific buyer quality requirements. When Canadian and American wheat both flowed through American export terminals, blending was easy. Buyers could get exactly the quality profile they needed. As Canadian grain bypasses American infrastructure, those blending opportunities disappear. American exporters lose flexibility in meeting buyer specifications. And fifth, competitive positioning. Canadian grain reaching Mexican and other markets more efficiently puts pressure on American grain prices. If Canadian wheat arrives in Mexico City cheaper and faster than American wheat, Mexican buyers have no reason to pay premiums for American supply. American farmers face a choice: cut prices to compete or lose market share entirely. Neither option is sustainable long-term. According to congressional reports, American farmers are already experiencing 3 consecutive years of substantial losses. Soybean exports collapsed 40%. Government subsidies are approaching $40 billion annually just to keep farms solvent. Now add systematic loss of Mexican grain markets on top of those existing problems. The cumulative effect is catastrophic for American agricultural competitiveness. Conclusion. The trade route Trump broke 3,200 kilometers from Manitoba to Mexico City, a single grain train that represents the most significant shift in North American agricultural trade in modern history. For 30 years, Mexican grain imports came primarily from the United States. That pattern was so established, so predictable, that everyone assumed it was permanent. Geography made it inevitable. Infrastructure reinforced it. Economic logic supported it. Then Trump launched a trade war to protect American farmers. He threatened Mexico. He created chaos at the border. He turned reliable trade relationships into tools for political pressure. And Mexico quietly started buying from Canada instead. Canadian Pacific Kansas City built a 3,200-kilometer rail corridor connecting Canadian producers directly to Mexican buyers. Mark Carney celebrated its success, standing in Mexico City, alongside Keith Creel. CPKC invested $500 million in hopper cars and locomotives specifically to move Canadian grain south. Canada launched electronic phytosanitary certification to streamline agricultural exports to Mexico. Mexican buyers signed long-term supply contracts with Canadian producers. Flour mills retooled operations to process Canadian wheat. Supply chains were restructured around Canadian reliability instead of American chaos. And American ports, American railways, American export terminals watched billions in business disappear. Gulf Coast ports that used to handle Canadian grain bound for Latin America faced declining volumes. Pacific Northwest terminals that used to ship Canadian grain to Asia lost traffic to Vancouver and Prince Rupert. Great Lakes ports that moved Canadian grain through the St. Lawrence Seaway saw business shift to Montreal and Quebec. The entire American agricultural export infrastructure that profited from handling Canadian grain, in addition to American grain, is contracting, not because of market forces, not because of competition, but because Trump made American supply unreliable and Canada built alternatives. Here's the irony Trump will never understand. He negotiated USMCA to lock Mexico into North American trade. He promised it would protect American farmers forever. He called it the greatest trade deal in American history. And it does lock Mexico into North American trade. It just doesn't specify that the grain has to be American. USMCA provides Canadian producers the exact same tariff-free access to Mexican markets that it provides American producers. So when Trump's chaos made American supply unreliable, Mexican buyers had a legal, tariff-free alternative waiting. Canada used Trump's own trade agreement to systematically replace American agricultural exports. The 3,200-kilometer grain train from Manitoba to Mexico City isn't just about wheat. It's about what happens when you treat trade partners as subordinates instead of partners, when you threaten instead of cooperate, when you create chaos instead of stability. Mexican buyers learned they can't depend on American supply, so they found suppliers they can depend on. Canadian producers learned Mexican markets are profitable and reliable, so they invested in serving them long-term. CPKC learned that Canadian-Mexican grain trade generates revenue across their entire three-nation network, so they built infrastructure to expand it. And American exporters learned that geographic proximity doesn't guarantee market access, that 30-year relationships can collapse in months when trust is destroyed, that once trade routes shift, they rarely return. Trump wanted to protect American farmers through strength and threats. Instead, he gave away their markets to Canada through chaos and unreliability. The grain is still moving. The farmers are still growing. The buyers are still buying. America is just no longer necessary for any of it. 3,200 kilometers from Manitoba to Mexico City. A single rail line proving that in 21st century trade, reliability matters more than proximity. That partnerships outlast pressure. That trust, once broken, creates opportunities for those who offer stability instead. Trump broke American agricultural trade with Mexico. Canada built the railroad to replace it. And every train that rolls from Manitoba to Mexico City is proof that the trade route Trump thought he controlled was never really his at all.